At this point, we've got a working chat application. But before you deploy a web application to the world, you want to make sure it's as fast as possible and that you'll know if something goes wrong with it. In this next section, we'll use CloudFront to get the resources for our chat application closer to the users, making our application that much more responsive. We'll set up monitoring so we can know when something goes wrong and have the metrics we need to troubleshoot outages when they happen. And there's a bit more final housekeeping we need to take care of too. So let's start buttoning this serverless chat application up, and soon we'll have a production-ready system that you put together yourself. So first we're going to talk about versioning in Lambda, and this is a way that you can protect yourself from boneheaded mistakes getting deployed into production and not being able to deal with it quickly. And believe me, in the real world that happens all the time. So to make life a little bit easier, let's start by opening up 3 different tabs in your browser. The first tab should be at your web application with the people.html page pulled up. So you should be seeing something like this. Obviously your URL will look different from mine because your bucket is different from mine. So have that up in one. That's going to be our application that we play around with. And we're also going to open up the Lambda console in the AWS console here. And also open up the API gateway console as well. So get those 3 things ready and it'll make life a little bit easier. So let me start by illustrating the problem that we're trying to solve. So here we are at the page that lists all the users. It's what we should see. I'm currently logged in as Picard, so I'm seeing everybody else that's in the system, Brian, Frank, and Riker, that we've added so far. Now let's go to the Lambda console and make a change there. So remember, this application is talking to the API gateway, which in turn talks to Lambda whenever we do something. So this page in particular is doing a chat users get call. So let's mess with that. Let's break it. So under Lambda, I'm going to go to chat users get and scroll down to line 21. So this is where we're adding the list of users. So let's say I did something really, really weird here, like saying logins.push. This shouldn't be here. Let's go ahead and save that. And now let's reload our people page. And now we have this new extra user in there called this shouldn't be here. Now it's kind of a contrived example, granted, but it's an example of where a mistake could creep into your code and you might not immediately know how to quickly roll it back, right? I mean, I would have to, if someone just hit the save button there by mistake while they were still coding, right? I could have who knows what on this page. So this isn't really a very good system to have in production for making sure that things run smoothly while you're still developing. How do I test things? How do I develop things without actually pushing it to production in the process? That's what versions are all about. Now, in the real world, we want to have changes to our Lambda functions tested before they get used in production. So we don't want to be in a world where we just hit save while we're developing and who knows what happens to our actual website in the real world. This is bad. So let's fix that. First of all, let's fix things. We do know that we can just remove that line to fix it for now, because we know what we did, fortunately, and hit save to put things back to normal. So we're going to play around with Lambda versioning, just so that we can have an application that's safe from careless changes like that. So here's what we do. At the top of the page, we're going to go to the Actions drop-down menu here and say Publish New Version. And you can type in a version description. We'll just say this is the original version of the code or something, whatever you want to call it. Just a little bit of note to remind yourself of what this version's all about. And click on Publish. So now next to the Actions button, it says version 1. And if we drop that down, you'll see there's actually 2 versions here. There's $latest and 1. So this means that we're currently looking at version 1 of this Lambda function. That's what we just created here. And you'll see that it's also grayed out and uneditable if you scroll down to the code. That's because versions, once you publish them, are immutable. You cannot change them. They can only be created and deleted. So if we do want to edit this, here's what you do. You go back up to the version dropdown here and say $latest. And that means you're working on the latest kind of head of the function here, but it's not actually the one that's deployed. So let's go back down here and put that bad line back in. We'll say logins.push. Why is this here? You can say whatever you want. Have some fun with it if you want. And hit save to save that error. And now we're back to where we were. If we go back and reload the serverless chat here. So by saving that $latest version, we have in fact pushed that to production. So we're not really getting the benefit of having versions at this point yet, right? So let's fix that. Let's go to the API gateway and go to our chat API. And if we go to users get, that's the one we're messing with, remember? Let's go to integration request. Now we can edit the Lambda function at this point and put a :1 at the end of it. Okay, so that's specifying that we want to be using version 1 of the Lambda function, not the latest one. Let's hit the check mark there to save that. Now, since we made a change to the API, we need to deploy it next. So I'll say deploy API to prod for now. And let's reload that page again. Might take a few tries for that to pick it up. Those API publishes take a little bit of time sometimes. But eventually, we should go back to version 1 of that Lambda function. There we are. So cool. We have successfully specified that we want to be using version 1 of our Lambda function in production, and that latest version that has an error in it is not live to the website. So that's a good thing, right? Even though it has some bad code in it, it's not affecting the production service because we're using a version to enforce that we are using a known good version of that Lambda function in production. So let's go back to Lambda. And now that we've made a change to the function, you're ready to push it to a testing environment. So how would we really want to deal with this change in the Lambda function? Let's say that we really wanted to add a feature that adds a user called "Why is this here?" on every people page. Well, you'd want to push that to a testing environment, right? So to do that, we're going to create a new version. So let's do that now. Actions, publish new version, and this has a weird user in it. And now we have version 2 published. So let's go back to the API gateway and switch to this version. Back to resources, users get, and integration request. And we're going to change the Lambda function to version 2. And here's where the test environment comes in. We're going to deploy, but we're going to deploy to a new stage called test. So we're finally using stages as they were intended to be used in the API gateway here. So let's go ahead and say actions deploy API. Now there's a couple of things to think about when creating this new stage. First of all, the URL is going to be different. So in this case, the /prod on the end has been replaced by /test. And second, the client libraries are generated per stage. It's not easy to use the same client library for all stages, so you basically have to hack the generated code to allow replacing the URL. And if we were to follow this to its natural conclusion, we would create another S3 bucket that uses the client for this stage, and we could then use that for testing. Now we're not going to go through all that now because we've already taught you how to do all that stuff. But for now, let's deploy this. So we're going to say new stage. We're going to call it test. Call it whatever you want. Testing environment. And if you want a description, you can. We'll go ahead and deploy that. All right, so now we have a test stage here, and there's that /test at the end instead of /prod. Okay, so that's cool. We now have a different world that we can live within under /test that has that new change that we can test out in isolation without actually affecting our production deployment. So the next thing you have to think about is promotion. Let's say that we do test out this change in our /test world. How do I promote that to production and take that test environment and make it the new production environment? Well, let's take a look. So let's go to the deployment history of our test stage. We're currently under test, and we can click on deployment history. So this shows all the deployments that have been created to any stage for this API. It's not just restricted to the test stage, obviously, because there's a bunch of them here. But the current deployment for the stage has a check mark next to it. Now note the timestamp next to it. That is the one that we just deployed. And if we go to our prod stage and look at its deployment history, you'll see that it's actually one deployment behind. It's using the previous one that we put out. So let's select the new deployment. And we're going to click Change Deployment down here at the bottom. Now we knew we could match that up based on the deployment timestamp from what's currently deployed to test. So we're selecting what's currently deployed to test and making that the current deployment for prod here. Let's click on Change Deployment. And now we can go back and reload our app again until we see that new offending user show up in production. And there is our offending user called "Why is this here?" So of course we can always roll back to the version that we had previously. Let's go ahead and do that now. Back to the API gateway, you can just select the previous one and go back to it. And if we reload a little bit, our friend why is this here should go away. And so it did. So let's do something even more advanced. So we're going to use something called Canary to actually allow us to slowly ramp up traffic to a new deployment. Instead of going all in on a new release, we can actually start trickling traffic to it in a controlled manner instead. So let's go back to the API gateway and go to our prod stage. Let's scroll up and go to Canary. And we're going to say create Canary. The metaphor here is a canary in the coal mine. So, you have this little test deployment that's out there taking a little bit of traffic, and you can see if there's any problems with it before it actually goes all in and destroys your entire website. So create Canary. And let's set the percentage of requests directed to Canary to 50%. All right, so the deployment date should show the first one that we just rolled back to. And now if we go back to resources and deploy to the prod stage, it should now say Canary enabled. Deploy. And if you go back to the Canary configuration here, you can see that we now have a new deployment date of just now, whatever time that happens to be for you. Now, unfortunately, deployment seems to be the best way to get Canary to work. Just selecting a deployment does not seem to do what you would want. But anyway, now if you reload the page a lot, you should see some interesting behavior. Basically, some of the requests have why is this here and some of them don't, because there's a 50-50 chance of being sent to one version of our app versus the other. So this is a way of testing out that change in a more controlled manner that doesn't impact all of your users, in this case only half of them. But you could set that ratio to whatever you want, obviously. So let's delete the Canary before we go on. Goodbye, Canary. All right, so before we finish, there's one more versioning feature in Lambda to talk about. Let's go back to our function and create an alias from the action menu. This is kind of a neat little thing. We'll select chat users get, go to actions, create alias. Let's name it test, and we'll select version 1 with no additional version. Now, once we create the alias, a lot of options go away. You basically just have the same options as when you created the alias. So now we can go to the API gateway, back to resources and users get and integration request. And now we can change that :2 to :test to execute the alias, which is currently pointing to version 1 actually. So let's hit the check mark on that. Deploy that to our prod stage. And once that takes effect, our user list should no longer include the bad username. Yep, seems to be gone. Now, similar to using Canary, we can use our alias to split traffic between versions 1 and 2 using the additional version option there. So back to Lambda. If we scroll down here, we can see that we have our test alias set up here. What we can do is set the additional version to 2 and set the weight to 50%. And if we save that, we should have similar behavior to when we were using Canary for the same purpose, where half the time we're seeing that additional user and half the time we don't. And yeah, sure enough, why is this here keeps showing up with about a 50-50 chance. So that's cool. So that's Lambda versioning for you. You should be able to create a process now that works for you and keeps your production application from getting all the changes that you're making without testing them first. So several different routes you can go here. Use whatever makes sense for your own process.